The small town of Burlington, Vermont, carries its scars in silence. Behind coffee shops with chalkboard menus and renovated brick facades, the past lingers like a ghost that refuses to leave. On the edge of a quiet park, beneath maple trees that flame red in the fall, an old man sleeps on a weathered wooden bench. His back is hunched, his clothes worn thin, and his presence mostly ignored by people passing on their way to work or errands. To them, he is just another homeless man, a shadow that blends into the city. But around his neck hangs something that refuses to blend in. A dull piece of metal, scratched by time yet still legible, a dog tag. On it, etched in faded letters, is a name, Alexander M. He often sleeps there, wrapped in a blanket that smells of rain and smoke. His face is deeply lined, each crease a story no one bothers to ask about. The only ones who pause near him are dogs tugging at their leashes, as if they can sense a pain that people have forgotten how to see. On a bright afternoon, a 10-year-old boy named Matthew runs across the grass, chasing a bull while his grandmother sits nearby on a bench. As the sunlight falls across the veteran's chest, the dog tag glints for a moment. Curious, Matthew steps closer, leans over the man and reads the name out loud, Alexander M. The laughter in his voice fades. His grandmother, Joan, who had been digging through her purse, freezes. Her hands stiffen. Slowly she looks up. The color drains from her face. That name, it is more than a coincidence. It is a buried echo from another lifetime, a memory she carried in silence. Decades ago, before marriage and children, Joan had loved a young man named Alexander. He was a soldier who promised to come back. He wrote poems on scraps of paper, planted wildflowers in her mother's yard, and told her that his smile would always be her home. But then the draft called him away, swept into a war on foreign soil that had nothing to do with their small town. He vanished into combat, into dust and silence. Joan waited, she wrote letters, she prayed, but no reply ever came. Eventually, she had to accept what seemed inevitable, that he had died overseas, or worse, chosen never to return. She buried her grief in a quiet life, married another man, and built a family. And now, here he was, sitting on a bench, alive but broken, a stranger and yet unmistakably the man she once knew. Her eyes welled with tears as Matthew turned to her, puzzled. "Grandma, do you know him?" he asked. The past, carefully packed away in boxes of silence, suddenly stood before her in flesh and blood. All it took was the shine of a dog tag and a child's innocent voice to unlock wounds she thought had healed long ago. And when the truth steps out of hiding, it has the power to heal or to destroy. If this story is already touching you the way it touched me while writing, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep sharing stories that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next will change everything. For Alexander, returning to Burlington was not a homecoming, but a painful confrontation with the fact that home can become a place that evolves without you, as if the years of war, hospitals, and silence had happened in a parallel world that no longer connected with this one. He remembered the narrow streets lined with red brick houses, the corner store where he once bought sodas with Joan, the little diner where they used to sit at the counter and share fries, believing that a promise and a kiss could be stronger than the pull of history. But now, as he walked the streets with slow, uneven steps, he saw glass storefronts glowing with neon signs, college kids hurrying by with phones in their hands, and coffee shops with names in foreign languages that seemed to belong to another universe. The Burlington he had known had vanished, and he felt the sting of being a stranger in what was once his own world. He hardly spoke anymore, not because he couldn't, but because he had long since learned that words could not bring back what was lost, not the youth he had wasted in desert sands, not the comrades buried in foreign soil, and certainly not the woman he had once promised to return to. He lived off spare change, coins tossed into a cup without eye contact, given not out of kindness, but as a way for people to hurry their consciences along. His hands trembled, not from the cold alone, but as if they still carried the weight of a rifle that had been his burden decades ago. And yet everything changed in that one instant when Matthew, that 10-year-old boy with no sense of history's weight, read his name aloud. It wasn't just the sound of his name, though he hadn't heard it spoken that way in years, but the way Joan, sitting nearby, reacted to it. Even before he turned to face her, Alexander could feel the air shift. He looked up, and there she was, a face he had conjured in memory 1,000 times, a face older now, lined with years, but unmistakable. Joan had built her life with quiet steadiness. She raised children, paid bills, hosted Sunday dinners, and aged with the dignity of someone who carried unspoken grief in the marrow of her bones. Outwardly, she had moved on, but inside, she had never stopped waiting for a sign, a letter, a knock at the door, even a rumor that Alexander was still alive. Each year, without word, forced her further into acceptance, until she finally laid the hope to rest, convinced he was gone. Now, hearing Matthew speak that name, his name, felt like a knife twisting through decades of fragile peace. She gripped the bench, her knuckles white, as memories she thought buried forever surged to the surface. She saw flashes of him in uniform, the boy who brought her daisies in the summer, who swore that no matter where the army sent him, he'd come back to her. "Grandma, do you know him?" Matthew asked again, his voice slicing through the heavy silence. Alexander recognized her too. He had always wondered what she might look like after all these years, whether she would remember him, whether she hated him for not returning. Now that he saw her, he felt unworthy of speaking, because no words could possibly repair the damage time had done. He lowered his eyes, ashamed, while Joan's breath caught in her throat. The park around them carried on, joggers with headphones, strollers rolling by, leaves rustling in the breeze. But for the three of them, time had stopped. Joan saw in him both the boy she had loved and the broken man he had become, and she didn't know whether to weep for joy or for loss. Alexander slowly reached for the dog tag at his chest, holding it up not as proof but as confession, as if to say, "Yes, it's me. I am still here, though barely." Matthew stood between them, confused by the silence, sensing that something deep and unspoken passed through the air. He asked the innocent question children ask without realizing its weight. "Grandma, was he your friend?" Joan felt her throat tighten, because that single word, friend, was both too small and too vast to contain what they had once shared. She nodded faintly, tears sliding down her face, knowing that this was only the beginning of a reckoning she had avoided her whole life. This meeting was just the start. The Burlington Alexander, no longer recognized, began to return fragments of himself to him, not through places or streets, but through the eyes of the woman who once loved him and the voice of a child who unknowingly had called his name back into the present. But neither of them yet understood how deep the scars ran, or what truths the silence of those years still concealed. At night, when sleep eluded him and the sounds of Burlington seemed too peaceful to belong to his life, Alexander found himself pulled back into the heat and dust of Afghanistan, back to the year 1982, when he still believed a letter and a promise could carry him through the darkness of firefights, explosions, and endless stretches of desert. He had been barely older than the fresh-faced recruits who stumbled beside him, but already his features had taken on the harsh lines, carved by deprivation and fear, as though war had the power to age a man long before time itself could. He remembered one evening vividly when he sat in the ruins of an old schoolhouse that had been converted into a makeshift aid station, his left hand bandaged and nearly useless, a scrap of paper trembling in his grasp like the last fragile connection to another life. With clumsy handwriting, in broken English that even his fellow soldiers struggled to read, he poured out words to Joan, words inadequate to hold the vastness of what he felt, but still the only words he had. He wrote about mountains that rose like prison walls, about nights when the cold bit deep despite the day's burning sun, and above all about the longing that kept him alive. The promise he had whispered to her on her parents' porch, under a porch light buzzing with moths, when the world still seemed small enough for love to protect. But the letter never reached her. A superior officer snatched it away, citing security, claiming private mail could fall into enemy hands, and Alexander knew in that moment his words might never leave the desert. The paper did not vanish entirely. He stole it back later, tucking it into his pack, keeping it folded against his chest, as if the creases themselves were stitches holding his heart together. That letter followed him into the hospitals and through the years of silence, until the ink faded, the edges frayed, and it became less a letter than a relic, a worn testimony of a vow swallowed by history. The war was not just fire and blood, it was the emptiness between bursts of gunfire, the seconds of silence that weighed heavier than the explosions, the spaces where fear turned inward and bred despair. Alexander lost friends whose names he never dared to speak aloud again, because the weight of carrying them would have broken him. He saw men cry like children, heard screams that imprinted themselves onto his nights, and lived every day with guilt that his heart still beat while theirs had stopped in the dust. There was one night that never left him, an ambush in a narrow canyon, the sudden blaze of rifles echoing off stone, the searing pain when a bullet tore through his side and dropped him into the dirt. The sky above blurred into smoke and sparks as he drifted in and out of consciousness. He awoke not on the battlefield, but in a military hospital, far from the front, bandaged, weak, and surrounded by unfamiliar faces. No one could tell him who had survived, who had fallen. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, and the hospital walls closed around him until he could no longer separate memory from fever dream. Through it all, two things tethered him to the world beyond war: the dog tag on his chest and the folded letter he could not bring himself to throw away. Together, they were proof that once, somewhere, a life had existed for him outside the dust and gunfire, a life that might still be waiting. But when he finally returned home, long after his body had healed in ways his mind never could, the world he had once known was gone. The Cold War was fading, the headlines had shifted, towns had moved on, and the people he had once loved had learned to live without him. America had buried Vietnam, turned to other concerns, and no one wanted to hear stories about a forgotten war halfway around the world. He carried his silence through one city after another, never staying long, never daring to look for Joan, not because he had forgotten her, but because he no longer recognized himself and feared she would not either. Instead, he wore the dog tag like a talisman, kept the faded letter as a confession never spoken, and drifted through decades like a shadow, unwilling to re-enter the light. And yet, sitting in that Vermont park all these years later, hearing his name spoken by a child, Alexander felt the weight of destiny pressing down on him. The letter, worn thin from decades of being folded and unfolded, had finally found its moment. Not through the mail, not through the hands of soldiers, but through the innocent eyes of a boy who had unknowingly carried his name back into the world of the living. And Alexander understood then, in the hollow of his chest, that the silence he had carried could no longer remain unbroken. The past, with all its pain and unfinished words, was coming to claim him, and this time there was no place left to hide. When Matthew insisted, with the persistence only a child could carry, that Alexander should come to his grandmother's house, it was not just the curiosity of youth guiding him, but something larger, an invisible force that seemed to be tugging at all three lives. Alexander hesitated at first, the instinct of a man who had learned to survive by keeping distance, by staying invisible, but eventually he gave a weary nod. His steps were slow and reluctant, yet beneath that reluctance lived a quiet yearning, an unspoken recognition that perhaps only by facing Joan again could he close the circle that had been torn open so long ago. The house Matthew led him to was modest, the kind of New England home that carried its age with pride rather than shame, where photographs on the walls were more than decoration. They were witnesses, silent guardians of a family's story. The furniture bore the polish of years, and the air smelled faintly of wood and spices, like a place that had seen many winters but never lost its warmth. When Joan opened the door and saw him standing in the frame, the air seemed to thicken, charged with a weight that words could never carry. Her eyes locked onto his, and though they were clouded now with age, they still carried the same blue she remembered from summer nights long ago, the blue that once made her laugh in the dark and believe in forever. Yet what she saw was not the boy who brought her wildflowers from the roadside, but a man broken, bent by a life of silence and exile. Her hand drifted to her chest instinctively, as if to steady her heart against the impossible reality before her. "Alexander," she whispered, the name trembling from her lips as though it had been waiting decades to be spoken. The silence that followed was not empty but heavy, filled with the years they had lost, the words unsent, the promises unkept. Alexander lowered his eyes, knowing that no apology could restore what had been stolen from them by war and fate. But Joan, though trembling, could not hold back the torrent of words any longer. "I wrote to you," she said, her voice breaking between anger and sorrow, "for years, again and again, but you never wrote back." His hands shook as he reached into his worn jacket pocket and pulled out the fragile yellowed paper he had carried like a second heartbeat. Without speaking, he handed it to her. She unfolded it with shaking fingers, and as her eyes traced the faded ink, the tears came. She understood without needing explanation. It was not his choice to be silent. The words had been trapped, stolen from him, buried by circumstances neither of them could control. "I thought you'd forgotten me," she whispered, her tears falling onto the fragile page. Alexander finally looked at her, his gaze stripped bare of defenses, showing only the desperate plea for understanding. He had not returned because he no longer believed he had the right. He had imagined her life moving forward, complete without him, and the shame of what he had become kept him from her doorstep. But Joan carried a secret of her own, one she had kept locked away all these years because there was never a chance to speak it aloud. Her voice trembled as she sank into a chair at the kitchen table, staring at him as if unsure she had the strength to go on. "I had a son," she said at last, the words heavy with decades of silence. "Not long after you left, I believed he was yours, Alexander. He never knew I could never tell him. He died young, far too young. And I've lived with the question all my life, whether he was part of you." The revelation struck Alexander harder than any bullet ever had. A son, a life he never knew, a child he never held, a chapter of himself erased before it could even be written. His chest ached with a pain so raw it seemed to hollow him out. He pressed his hand against the table, searching for something solid to cling to, as the weight of what she said crashed over him. Matthew, sitting quietly nearby, could not grasp the depth of the words, but even he sensed that something irreversible had just been spoken, something that tied him not only to his grandmother, but to this broken man as well. His eyes flicked between them, puzzled as if trying to decipher the invisible current that bound them together. Alexander pushed the letter closer to Joan, not as proof, not even as explanation, but as an offering, a fragment of himself, the only piece he had left to give. Joan held it, her tears staining the paper, and she wept not just for the love they had lost, but for the life that might have been, the family they could have had, the future stolen by a war neither of them had chosen. It was not a reunion filled with joy, nor a miracle of second chances. It was a confrontation with the truth, raw and devastating, but also cleansing in its honesty. For in that kitchen, in the silence between sobs, both of them felt something stir, the faintest possibility that even broken love could still carry meaning, that unburdening secrets could carve space for forgiveness. When Joan finally closed the door behind them and Alexander stepped hesitantly inside, it felt less like a man entering a home than like a ghost re-entering the world of the living. The air carried the scent of simmering soup and lemon polish, the quiet hum of a life maintained with care. The dining room was small, with a heavy oak cabinet lined with porcelain, lace doilies that seemed older than Matthew himself, and photographs that testified to decades of birthdays, weddings, and Sunday gatherings. For Alexander, who had spent so many nights beneath overpasses and in shelters where the walls reeked of mildew and despair, the simple warmth of this room felt like another universe. Joan invited him to sit at the table. The words were plain, but to Alexander they carried the weight of absolution, as though her gesture alone granted him permission to exist once more among the living. Matthew darted about, restless and curious, bombarding him with questions about faraway places, about what it was like to be a soldier, about whether he had ever been scared. But Alexander, who carried the memories of screaming men and burning villages, did not speak of rifles or blood. Instead, he told the boy about flowers that bloomed in dry sand, about children who played soccer with tattered balls even among ruins, about a stray dog that followed him for weeks before vanishing into the night, as if sensing that war devoured companionship as easily as it did life. For Matthew, these were not war stories but wonder tales, glimpses of a world so different from his own suburban routine. And for Joan, listening from across the table, they revealed more than Alexander realized. They showed that despite everything, he had managed to hold on to fragments of beauty, to notice life even in places designed to extinguish it. That night, for the first time in decades, Alexander lay in a real bed. The mattress was soft, the blanket heavy with the scent of detergent, the pillow cool against his cheek. He could not sleep easily, his body too accustomed to the hardness of benches, the constant vigilance of the streets. But he closed his eyes with the strange sensation that, at least for one night, he was not lost. He understood, however, that such peace could not last. Perhaps it was the fleeting nature of the moment that made it unbearably precious. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, painting gold across the kitchen table, where Joan poured coffee and Matthew played with his cereal spoon. Alexander stepped into the backyard, where the grass sparkled with dew. He knelt in the dirt near the fence, scooping earth with calloused fingers, and planted a small flower he had brought from the front yard. Joan watched him from the window, and in that simple act she recognized the boy he once was. The boy who used to kneel in her mother's garden, pressing daisies into the soil, as if planting pieces of his heart for her to keep. Yet as tender as the moment was, Alexander knew he could not stay. His presence, he feared, would bring more weight than light, more memories than healing. He was a man shaped by absences, and though Joan had welcomed him in, he felt the truth pressing down. She deserved peace, not the shadow of his brokenness. So in the quiet hours before leaving, he wrote on the back of the faded envelope that still held the letter from the desert. His hand trembled as he scrawled, "So that one day you will understand what silence costs." He placed the envelope on the table, and with a soft voice asked Matthew to keep it, to open it only when he was older, old enough to understand that the lives of adults carried stories heavier than fairy tales. Before stepping out, Alexander met Joan's gaze one last time. There were no long speeches, no vows to meet again. Just a look, weighted with grief, filled with the love they once shared, carrying the acknowledgement that though their lives had diverged, they were still bound by something unbreakable. Joan reached for his hand, resting hers on top of his for a long, quiet moment, and in that touch, everything unsaid was spoken. He left in the early morning, his figure small against the stretch of road leading out of town. He carried no bag, no destination, only the knowledge that for one brief moment he had returned. Behind him, the wind rustled through the maples as though singing a farewell, not just to a soldier, but to a man who had finally found the courage not only to survive, but to let go. Years passed, and Burlington, like all American towns, kept changing. New businesses opened, streets were repaved, faces grew older, and generations came of age who had no memory of draft cards, ration books, or the cold fear of waiting for a loved one overseas. Yet beneath the surface, the past never fully disappeared. It lingered quietly in family stories, in framed photographs, in the silence that filled living rooms when certain questions went unanswered. Matthew grew up with those silences. He learned early that not everything in life could be explained at the dinner table, that sometimes the people you love carry unspoken grief that cannot be put into words. When he became a young man, curiosity mixed with reverence, he finally opened the envelope Alexander had left behind. Inside was the brittle, yellowed letter, the one Joan had never received, written with clumsy lines and ink blurred by sweat and dust. The words were simple, even broken, but in them Matthew felt the weight of a man trying to hold on to love in the middle of chaos. He read of the desert nights, of mountains that felt like walls, of promises whispered to keep fear at bay, and more than anything, he read the longing of a soldier who had carried the hope of coming home, even when the world had conspired to take that hope away. Matthew understood then what Alexander meant when he wrote, "So that you will know what silence costs." Silence had cost decades of love, the chance to raise a child together, the chance to build the life they once dreamed of. Silence had taken from Alexander his place in the world, and from Joan the closure she deserved. And yet, out of that silence, something still remained, a legacy that reached him, the grandson who had unknowingly become the bridge between their lives. By the time Matthew pieced together these truths, Joan had passed away, leaving behind a box of old photographs and a diary she had kept in private. In its pages, he found her handwriting, steady at first, shakier as the years went on, and there she wrote about Alexander, about nights when she prayed for him, about the unanswered letters, about the quiet ache of carrying his memory while trying to build a future without him. The diary did not end in bitterness, but in hope, a belief that love, even interrupted, had a way of leaving traces that time could not erase. Inspired by what he found, Matthew began to write. At first it was only notes, fragments of thoughts, but eventually it grew into a manuscript. He titled it Alexander M. He Returned, Even If Too Late. It was not a story of battlefield heroics or medals, but of silence, of longing, and of the invisible scars wars leave in families long after the fighting ends. It was a book about memory, about what we inherit without ever asking for it, and about the small miracles, like a boy reading a name on a dog tag, that reconnect lives thought forever lost. The town of Burlington honored Alexander in its own quiet way. On the park bench where he had spent so many nights, the city placed a small plaque that read, Alexander M. He returned, even if too late. There was no statue, no parade, no speeches, just a piece of metal on weathered wood, a reminder that behind every forgotten soldier is a story waiting to be uncovered. Matthew, now a father himself, often walked past that bench with his son. He would stop, point to the plaque and tell the story, not as a legend, not as fiction, but as truth. He told him that sometimes the smallest acts, reading a name, asking a question, holding someone's hand, are what heal the wounds history leaves behind. And so, Alexander's legacy did not fade into the silence he carried for so long. It lived on in Matthew's words, in Joan's diary, in the plaque on a bench in a Vermont park, and in the hearts of those who learned that love and memory, even delayed, still have the power to redeem. Because sometimes it takes the innocent eyes of a child to reconnect lives shattered by war, and sometimes it takes decades of silence for a single truth to finally be spoken. We post new videos every day, real stories that touch and inspire.